Wind drove the dust low along the main street of Dustwater, curling around wagon wheels and hitching posts, rattling the warped shutters of the saloon. The air had that baked, metallic taste of summer on the high plains, where even the flies seemed tired. Thorn Avery reined his bay gelding in front of the mercantile, watching the small knot of townsfolk gathered by the trough. He didn't hear their words at first, just the tone, the way their voices pressed low, like they were speaking over something too bitter to say out loud. Then he saw her, a woman, not much older than 25, stood in the hard light of noon, her back stiff, her face pale beneath the brim of a straw hat gone limp at the edges. Her dress was plain calico, sun-faded and worn thin at the elbows. A baby clung to her hip, its cheeks streaked with dust and tears. Beside her, two little girls clutched the hem of her skirt, their bare feet powder white with road dirt. No man stood with them, no wagon waited, just the open street behind her and the small pile of things at her feet. A rolled quilt, a battered tin pail, and a sack of cornmeal. "She's not welcome here," the storekeeper, Amos Pike, was saying to no one in particular, though his eyes never left her. Her own kin sent her off. "You know what for?" One of the older women sniffed. 3 girls in a row and no son. Said her husband needed a wife who could do better. She spat in the dust, as though that explained everything. Thorn felt his jaw set. He'd seen this kind of thing before, small-town justice dressed up like necessity. Folks here could turn colder than the mountain passes when they decided a person didn't belong. The woman kept her eyes fixed somewhere past them all, her chin lifted just enough to look like defiance, though Thorn could see the way her fingers tightened on the girl's shoulders. The baby whimpered against her collarbone. The wind carried the creak of the saloon sign and the faint jingle of a spurred boot from somewhere down the street. Everything else felt still, waiting. "Best she keep walking," Pike added. "Ain't nothing for her here." Thorn swung down from his horse. The leather creaked under his boots as he stepped off the street and into the little half-circle of bodies. He could feel their eyes flick his way, the subtle shift of weight as folks made room without meaning to. He didn't look at them. He looked at her. Up close, she was paler still, her lips cracked, the hollows under her cheekbones sharp. She met his gaze only for a second before glancing toward the dirt at her feet, as though eye contact was a thing that could cost her. The girls beside her clung tighter. "What's your name?" Thorn asked, his voice low enough that the words didn't feel like a challenge. She hesitated. "Ada," she said finally. Her voice was rough, like it hadn't been used much in the last few days. "And them?" He nodded toward the girls. Her mouth twitched. "Hattie, Rose, and this here's Ruth." Ruth squirmed at the sound of her name, a small, muffled protest into her mother's shoulder. Thorn glanced at the pail and quilt on the ground. Then he looked past her, down the empty street shimmering in the heat. He didn't see a wagon or a mule or anything that would take her anywhere worth going. The silence thickened again, that watchful, waiting kind of quiet that made a man aware of every move he was about to make. Thorn shifted his weight, one hand on his belt. "Come home with me." The words landed like a stone dropped in a still pond. Every head turned his way. "She don't need your charity, Thorn," Amos Pike said, his voice sharp. "Ain't wise bringing another man's trouble to your place." "I'm not asking what's wise," Thorn said without looking at him. His gaze stayed on Ada. "Just asking if you're coming." Her eyes widened just a fraction. She didn't answer right away. Her grip on the girls didn't loosen, but her shoulders dropped the smallest bit, like she'd been holding her breath for too long. Pike made a sound halfway between a scoff and a laugh. "You always did have more heart than sense." Thorn bent and picked up the quilt, tossing it over his shoulder. "Hearts kept me alive longer than sense ever did." Ada still hadn't moved. He waited, the dust curling around their boots, the sunlight glaring hard enough to wash the color from everything. Finally, she shifted the baby on her hip and took one slow step toward him. Then another. The girls followed, their bare feet whispering against the dirt. She didn't look back. By the time they reached his gelding, the voices behind them had started again, lower this time, like a distant river behind the trees. Thorn helped her onto the saddle, the quilt between her and the worn leather, then lifted Hattie up behind her. Rose he picked up and settled in front of him, her small hands gripping the horn. The horse shifted under the weight, the leather creaking. Thorn swung up behind them and took the reins. They rode out under the hot, empty sky, the sound of the town fading behind them. The prairie opened up ahead, a long roll of gold and shadow stretching toward the far line of the hills. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled low and slow, though the sky above was still bright. He didn't know yet what storm was coming, only that it was. The late afternoon sun hung low over the plains, turning the grass a deep amber and casting the fence posts in long, crooked shadows. The ride to Thorn Avery's ranch took the better part of 2 hours, and in all that time, Ada Bloom said almost nothing. The baby, Ruth, slept against her shoulder. Hattie sat behind her mother, quiet as stone. Only Rose, perched in front of Thorn, glanced back now and then, her dark eyes sharp, measuring him. When the small cluster of weathered buildings finally came into view, a long, low house of rough-hewn timber, a barn leaning with age but sturdy in its frame, a corral holding 3 lean cattle, Thorn felt something loosen in his chest. Home might be a lonely word out here, but it was still better than the nothing Ada had been given. He swung down, set Rose on her feet, and offered a hand to Ada. She slid off the horse slowly, almost reluctantly, as though stepping onto his land meant she was crossing a line she couldn't uncross. "I'll get water from the pump," Thorn said, tying off the reins. "Barn's there. House is there. If you're hungry, I can work." Ada cut in. Her voice was quiet but firm, her eyes on the dusty ground. "Don't need your charity." "It's not charity," Thorn replied. "It's supper. Everyone's welcome to supper." She didn't answer, but her hands shifted the baby closer to her chest. The wind picked up, fluttering the hem of her calico dress. Inside, the house smelled faintly of coffee and pine smoke. The floorboards creaked under their boots. Thorn lit the oil lamp on the table, its warm glow softening the sharp lines of the room. He ladled stew from the pot hanging over the hearth into bowls and set them down with thick slices of bread. The girls ate like they hadn't seen a meal in days, small hands moving fast, eyes down, bread vanishing in quick bites. Ada ate slower, measured, but Thorn could see the hollows in her cheeks filling slightly with color. When the bowls were scraped clean, Ada stood and gathered the dishes without a word. She moved with a sort of practiced economy, no wasted steps, no hesitation about a stranger's home. Thorn let her work, leaning back in his chair and watching the lamplight catch the curve of her jaw, the way her shoulders stayed tense even in stillness. "You said your kin sent you away," Thorn said after a long silence. Ada's hands stilled on the dishcloth. She kept her back to him. "Not my kin, my husband's. Said I wasn't worth the trouble of keeping. A man needs sons. That's what they told me." "And your husband?" Thorn asked. Her shoulders gave the faintest twitch. Didn't argue. The wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere outside, the gelding snorted softly in the corral. "You can stay here a while," Thorn said, "till you figure where you want to go." She turned at that, her eyes catching his. "And if I never figure?" Thorn didn't answer right away. He took his time, scratched at the rough stubble on his jaw, and met her gaze without flinching. "Then you'll still have a roof." That night, Ada and the girls slept in the small back room, the baby's soft breathing mixing with the quiet rustle of the wind through the cottonwoods. Thorn lay awake in his own bed, staring at the low ceiling, thinking about the eyes of the people in Dustwater when he'd led her away. By morning, word had already spread. He knew it the moment he rode into town for supplies. Conversations hushed when he passed. Men nodded stiffly instead of calling out. At the Mercantile, Amos Pike stood behind the counter with his arms crossed. "You picked yourself up a problem, Avery," Pike said, handing him a sack of flour. "Seems to me she's just a woman needing a place to rest," Thorn replied. Pike leaned forward. "She's a burden you didn't have to take on. Women like her bring trouble. Folks start thinking she's yours. They'll remember she was cast out." Folk can think what they like. Pike's voice dropped. They will. And they'll remember the day her kin ran her off. On the way back, Thorn stopped at the edge of his own land. From the rise, he could see Ada hanging wash on the line, the baby tied against her chest with a strip of cloth, the girls chasing each other in the grass. A faint smile touched his mouth, until he saw the dust cloud moving along the horizon. It wasn't just wind. 3 riders, coming slow, not from Dustwater, and not the kind of riders who pass through without asking questions. He stayed there a moment, his hand on the worn butt of his colt, the wind pulling at his coat. The riders would be at his gate before sundown. The sun was low, a molten coin sliding toward the rim of the prairie, when the 3 riders reined in at Thorn Avery's gate. The air was still, save for the creak of saddle leather and the faint jingle of bits. Their horses, rangy and trail-dusted, pawed at the ground, restless from the long ride. Thorn had been waiting on the porch, hat brim pulled low, a shadow cutting across his face. Beside the house, Ada stood half-hidden behind the wash line. The baby bound close to her and the 2 older girls pressed into the folds of her skirt. Her eyes tracked the strangers, though her body stayed still as stone. The lead rider swung down, tall, narrow in the shoulders, his duster flaring slightly in the evening wind. His hair was streaked with gray, his eyes pale and watchful. He tipped his hat, but there was no warmth in the gesture. "Name's Briggs," he said. "These here are Nolan and Fitch." He jerked his head toward the other 2, one broad and heavy-set, the other thin with a snake's smile. "We're looking for a woman and 3 girls. Passed through Dustwater not 2 days ago." Thorn didn't move from his spot on the porch. "Dustwater sees a lot of people." Briggs' mouth tightened. "This one's got kin looking for her. Says she's run off with what ain't hers." Ada's hand shifted on the baby's back. Thorn caught the motion out of the corner of his eye. "She take something?" Thorn asked evenly. 3 girls, Briggs said. "One of 'em a man's blood, rightful to him. Her husband's demanding them back." Thorn's gaze stayed steady. "Don't sound to me like they're cattle to be claimed." Fitch spat in the dirt. "You keeping her here, Avery? That the truth?" Silence stretched between them, the sound of a meadowlark far off the only thing breaking it. Thorn felt the weight of the Colt in its holster, the boards under his boots, the scent of dry grass in the air. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to hand her over and send them on their way. Let the trouble ride out with them. But Ada's eyes met his then, and there was something in them. Not pleading exactly, but a bare, flickering kind of defiance that a man had to respect. "She's under my roof," Thorn said finally. "And under my roof means she stays put till she says otherwise." Nolan's laugh was short and cold. "That's a mighty expensive kindness, Avery. Folks like her got a way of drawing trouble, and trouble's got a way of costing blood." "I'll pay my own costs," Thorn replied. Briggs studied him a moment, then put his boot in the stirrup and swung back into the saddle. "We'll be back," he said. "Next time, maybe with the law in tow, or someone less inclined to talk first." They rode off without another word, the dust they kicked up hanging in the still air long after they were gone. Ada stepped out from behind the wash line. The girls stayed close, their small hands clutching at her dress. "They'll come again," she said quietly. "Most likely," Thorn answered. "But I'll be here." The night came on sharp, the prairie wind cutting colder than it had in days. Thorn sat by the window, a lamp burning low, his rifle leaned against the wall. Out beyond the dark, coyotes yipped at the rising moon. By morning, the rumors had reached Dustwater and twisted into something meaner. At the blacksmith's, a man muttered about Thorn harboring stolen kin. At the saloon, someone swore they'd seen Ada in the company of outlaws before her marriage. Even the preacher's wife was said to be gathering signatures for some kind of petition. That afternoon, a wagon rattled up the lane. A neighbor, Enoch Hale, sitting tall in the driver's seat. Hale was a man who liked order and the rules that kept it. "Thorn," Hale called, not bothering to dismount. "I hear you've got Briggs riled. That's a man you don't cross if you want a quiet life." Some things are worth crossing over, Thorn said. Not for her, Hale replied flatly. Not for a woman who can't keep a man's house the way he wants it. The whole town's watching now. You keep her here, you'll have every fool thinking you're making a claim. Let them think it, Thorn said. They'll think worse if I turn her out. Hale shook his head, clucked to his team, and rolled on. The wagon creaked down the lane until the sound faded into the wind. Thorn turned back toward the barn, but something caught his eye. A thin, dark column of smoke rising in the distance, too far to be a cook fire. He stood watching it until the wind shifted and carried a faint, rhythmic sound to his ears. Drums. Not close. Not yet. But coming. The drums carried on the wind like a heartbeat buried in the earth. Slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Thorn stood in the yard long enough for the sun to slip behind the ridge, painting the clouds in blood-orange streaks, before turning toward the house. Inside, Ada was mending one of Rose's dresses by lamplight. The baby was asleep in the corner crib he'd hauled in from the loft. Hattie sat cross-legged on the floor, carefully arranging a pile of smooth river stones into patterns only she understood. Rose leaned against the wall, eyes following her mother's needle. Thorn shut the door behind him, the latch clicking louder than he intended. You hear it? He asked. Ada's hands stilled on the fabric. Yes. She didn't look up. They're still a ways off, Thorn said. But they're coming from the south. Smoke too. Ada set the dress in her lap and lifted her gaze. That's not Briggs. No, Thorn said. It's not. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock and the low hiss of the lamp. Ada's voice was quieter when she spoke again. It'll be about me one way or another. Briggs might have lied about the law, but he wouldn't lie about wanting me gone. If he can't get me out himself, he'd trade the trouble to someone else. Thorn crossed the room and leaned against the wall near her chair. What do they have against you? Ada looked back at her needle and thread, twisting the thin steel between her fingers. It's not what I did. It's what I couldn't do. 3 girls in 3 years, and my husband's father told him it was a sign from God I was unfit to keep a house. They called me a bad omen, said I'd bring nothing but loss. And people believe what makes their lives easier to explain. Hattie glanced up at the word omen, her brow furrowing, but Ada gave her a faint shake of the head and the child went back to her stones. Thorn studied her profile, the shadows painting the fine lines of her cheek. You believe them? Ada's hands didn't stop moving this time. Believing them doesn't matter. They act on it all the same. A low thud from outside made them both turn, the sound of the barn door catching against the wind, then the squeal of its hinges. Thorn grabbed the rifle from behind the door and stepped onto the porch. The night had settled deep and wide over the prairie, the moon only a thin shard over the hills. Shapes moved near the far fence line. Not horses, not cattle, human silhouettes, slipping along the edge of his land, low and deliberate. One shape detached from the rest and walked forward until the firelight from a torch caught his face. High cheekbones, dark hair bound back, painted marks over his jaw. Behind him, more torches lit. Small points at first, then more, until the line of them curved like a glowing scar across the grass. Thorn's stomach tightened. It was a Comanche war party. They weren't charging. They were standing, waiting, facing the house like a jury before a verdict. Ada stepped to the doorway behind him, one arm around Ruth, the other holding Rose close. Her voice was barely above a whisper. They're not here by chance. Thorn kept his eyes on the torches. No, they're here with a purpose. The leader raised a hand, palm open toward the sky, and spoke a few words carried half by the wind. Thorn couldn't make out all of them, but one came clear enough, Kunapu. Woman. Ada stiffened. They're asking for me. Or sending a message, Thorn said. They'll keep asking until they get an answer, she replied. If you don't give it, they'll take it. The torches held steady in the dark, not advancing, not retreating. Thorn lowered the rifle's barrel, but he didn't step down from the porch. I'll talk to them in the morning, he said finally. Ada's voice was sharp now, though quiet. Morning might be too late. Thorn's gaze stayed fixed on the flickering line across the prairie. Then I guess we'll find out. Out in the dark, the drums began again. Slower now, but each beat heavy enough to travel through the ground and into the bones. The drums faded with the night, leaving the prairie in a silence so complete it seemed almost fragile. Thorn didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the front window with the rifle across his knees, watching the line of torches burn low and wink out one by one until only darkness remained. When the first pale light of dawn spilled across the grass, the war party was still there. 30 or more riders now, mounted, their ponies restless in the morning chill. The leader, the man with the painted jaw, nudged his horse forward until he stood alone between the party and the house. Thorn stepped down from the porch, his boots crunching in the frost-tipped grass. Ada watched from the doorway, the baby in her arms, Hattie and Rose clinging to her skirts. The two men faced each other in the brittle quiet. "You have something of ours," the Comanche leader said in English, the words slow, deliberate. His voice was deep, steady as stone. Thorn didn't flinch. "She's not a thing to be had. She's a person." The man's gaze shifted to Ada. 3 winters ago, her husband traded her for horses and rifles, promised her to my cousin. But before we came for her, her own people sent her away. A woman without people is not safe. Thorn's jaw tightened. "She is now." The leader studied him a long moment. "We came to take her to a place she will be kept. Federal sheltered. She will not be alone." Ada stepped out onto the porch, bare feet in the cold. "Kept?" she said quietly. "Like a thing you put away." The man's eyes softened, just a fraction. "Like a relative who is not yet trusted to walk alone." She shook her head. "I've been passed from hand to hand my whole life. I won't do it again. Not for you. Not for anyone." The war leader's gaze returned to Thorn. "You'll be responsible for her then. For them." "I already am," Thorn said. Something passed between them then, a recognition not born of liking, but of understanding. The man inclined his head once, sharply. He turned his horse, and without another word, the war party wheeled away, their ponies moving like smoke over the grass. In minutes, they were no more than shadows against the horizon. Thorn stood there a moment longer, the frost melting under the rising sun. When he turned back, Ada was still on the porch, the baby pressed close, her eyes fixed on him with something between disbelief and gratitude. "You didn't have to," she began. "Yeah," he said, cutting her off gently. "I did." The rest of the morning was quiet. Thorn went about his chores, mending fence, hauling water, while Ada and the girls worked in the garden, turning the soil for the spring planting. Once, he caught sight of Hattie and Rose giggling together, their hands deep in the dirt, the kind of laughter that comes when children start to believe they might belong somewhere. That night, after the girls were asleep, Ada lingered by the doorway, watching the last light fade from the sky. "You know they'll talk in town," she said. "They already do," Thorn replied, leaning back in his chair. "And you don't care?" He looked at her then, really looked, the weariness in her shoulders, the stubborn lift of her chin, the way she held herself like someone who'd had to be her own defense for too long. "Not enough to send you away," he said. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "I don't know what I can give you back." "Don't have to," he said simply. "Just stay." Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods, carrying the scent of fresh earth and wood smoke. The prairie stretched away into the dark, wide and open. But for the first time in a long while, Ada Bloom wasn't standing on the edge of it wondering where she'd go next. She was already home.